Thank you, my lords, and congratulations to Baroness Hayter for winning the legislative lottery. I too am envious of your luck, and thank her as well for choosing this important, focused but important topic. I used to work for a consultancy firm, and some of that work involved lobbying, so I have a personal experience of being subject to the regulatory regime that we were talking about today. Of course, it's perhaps no surprise to therefore add that I also share the views that others have expressed of the benefits that good, reputable lobbying can bring in terms of a useful dialogue and a useful exchange of information and expertise that can inform and therefore improve decision-making. But as Viscount Stangate mentioned earlier, sunlight is the best disinfectant. There absolutely are aspects of lobbying to be concerned about, to be nervous about, but the best way of protecting the good side and the genuinely beneficial side of lobbying is a strong dose of sunlight to distinguish that from other activities and behaviour. I'll talk a little bit more about, I think, the light touch nature of the current setup in a moment, as that has obviously come up a little bit in some of the speeches this morning. But first, I think it's worth highlighting just how back to front the situation is that we've ended up in, and we've had a little bit of the history lesson as to how we've ended up where we are. But it is a very odd back-to-front situation, because normally when we talk about regulation, we do it on the basis that the larger, the more powerful, the richer you are, the more important it is to be regulated. But instead, we've ended up with a situation that is the opposite. The small outfit that cannot afford an in-house lobbying operation employs consultant lobbyists and therefore is regulated. The large, rich, more powerful organisation that can afford an in-house team therefore escapes regulation. It's the exact opposite of what we have repeatedly legislated for in all sorts of other areas. It's also a back-to-front situation in that normally when we are discussing regulation in one form or another, one of the elements of the debate is hearing the people who will be most directly affected by the regulation saying, please don't go too far. What about, we don't want too many burdens placed upon us. And we obviously have to judge that against wider interests. But in this case, it is again back to front. As we have heard, through the CIPR and other industry bodies, the view of the lobbying industry overall, collectively, very much is that they wish the regulation to change. It feels a little Alice in Wonderland, where we are doing the exact opposite, have been doing the exact opposite of what we usually do in other areas. But as there have been some references to the sort of potential administrative burden of extending the current regime, I think it is worth highlighting a couple of points. One is, it is a pretty light touch regime. I certainly didn't feel that I was being unduly burdened. There was certainly a little bit of nervousness, I would say, when each time I would sort of collate the list of things that we needed to make sure that we were declaring, because that's a list you really don't want to leave something out from by mistake. But it is fundamentally a light touch, low cost regime. And Baroness Finn earlier said that in some ways this is not a cumbersome step. Well, I would only disagree slightly. I would say in every way it is not a cumbersome step. But also, I would say that if you compare the administrative and financial burdens, small though they are, that this bill would extend to some other firms, and if you compare that to the burdens that, for example, any of those firms who export goods or services to the European Union now face following Brexit, this is extremely small compared to those additional burdens that some in this House, at least, have enthusiastically argued are being a reasonable and acceptable step to take. There's also been some reference to the government's transparency data and to what extent does that provide an appropriate form of regulation of lobbying, and do we therefore really need to extend the current regime? Well, I think there are a couple of points worth reflecting on. One is, really, since that government transparency data was first introduced, there has been continuing queries, comments, sometimes complaints about the quality and timeliness and format of that data. And I think there's a point at which it's reasonable to say that problem has been going on for so long that simply hoping that that problem in itself will be fixed and everything will therefore be resolved is maybe not the right step to take. But also, more fundamentally, I think there are some occasions where double transparency, double regulation, if one wishes to call it, is the right thing to do. It is actually beneficial to not only have the government transparency data, hopefully in an improved, enhanced format, and also a requirement on lobbyists. That double procedure acts as a double protection. And indeed, we are quite used to the idea of doing something twice in order to be absolutely sure that we've got it right, with, for example, double-entry bookkeeping. Nobody who does double-entry bookkeeping thinks, this is an awful administrative burden, what a waste having to do everything twice. No, absolutely. Double-entry bookkeeping has become so widespread because the very act of doing things twice is a cross-check to make sure you are getting it right. And in this case, that sunlight is so important that having transparency requirements on both ends of the process is not a duplication or unnecessary. It's an essential part of having a robust system that we can trust in. Now, I suspect the noble lady, the Minister, will shortly be telling us about how the Ethics and Integrity Commission report on lobbying is shortly coming, and how, of course, in many ways it makes sense to roll this issue into a wider government response to that. And there are certainly other important issues, aspects to this topic that need addressing, as Viscount Stansgate, Lord Lansley, Lord Norton, Baroness Helleck, Lord MP and others have raised in this debate. But whatever route we choose to take, whether it is through this immediate bill in front of us now or a wider government response in due course, or perhaps even through both routes, it is important that there is change, because it is about enhancing and protecting our democracy and also, frankly, our own reputations. The more controversy, the more doubt, the more conspiracy theories, the more scandals there are around lobbying, the more that damages all of us in this House and in politics in general. And that is an important act of self-interest, one might think, but also an important act of public good to improve and enhance our systems. So yes, we should do more than what this bill offers, but that isn't a reason not to do the bit that this bill in front of us does give us the opportunity to do. So often we hear action is promised when legislative time allows. Well, we have some legislative time. We have a piece of legislation in front of us. So I hope the government and this House will in due course support this bill. Yeah.